Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are starting this evening our 31st year, I interview writers, often poets, about their craft, what they're working on, what they've accomplished, what they're planning for the future. It's a wider net than that, however. We have had on sculptors, painters, musicians, actors. So if you have an idea for an artist, writer or not, who might be a good guest for the Writer's Block, watch for our address at the end of the show. I also want to remind you that this show and all the other original programming out of 1623 studios is a product of cable access television. You don't get that with Dish, so you stick with us, you stick with cable. I've got one other little announcement. We have often started our fall season with the Poetry Without Paper winners. It was not possible in this COVID-19 era to get them together. So we are not going to have them on this year. We hope to return to that next year. I'm very happy to say this evening, we do have a poet, Moira Linehan, who is a return guest. She appeared on the show about 3 years ago, and we're here to talk about her new book and exploits, her new book titled Toward. Welcome to the show, Moira. It's nice to see you.
Thank you for having me, John. It's good to be back and it's good to see you.
And we are seeing ourselves via Zoom. The images are pretty good, not bad. I want to ask you first if you could remind us a little bit about your background. Remind us of a couple things that you went over 3 years ago. Where did you grow up and where are you now? And when did you get interested in poetry?
Well, I was born in Connecticut. I've lived most of my adult life in the Boston area and primarily in Winchester, Massachusetts for close to 40 years on a small pond called Winter Pond that does appear in each of my collections. It's hard to say when I first became interested in poetry or how, but I believe it started when I was very young and my father read to me. And I was, 6, 7, 8, he was reading to me Gerard Manley Hopkins, and I did not have a clue then, and maybe now still, as to what he was writing about, Dylan Thomas was writing about. He read me the Psalms, but he had a wonderful speaking voice. And I think that's what I keep trying to go back to, what I try to capture. I did not become a writer of poetry until graduate school, when I, by accident, to fill out my semester, took a poetry writing workshop.
And where was that?
Simmons. That was at Simmons in Boston. And the person leading the workshop said, you should continue with this. You've got some talent, which I had received contradictory information to that fact in high school. So from there, I was teaching. I taught at a school where 5 other people in this high school also wrote poetry. And so we formed a group. Eventually, I kept going on. I got an MFA in writing from Vermont College. And I stopped working full-time about 20 years ago in order to work on my own writing.
Let me ask you, there were 5 poets at high school. Were they all young women, or were there men in that group too?
I was the only woman.
Oh, really?
Yep.
My experience is that mostly males in high school get poetry psychologically beaten out of them by that age, but not there.
Well, they don't even sometimes get to be teaching. English. So it was unusual. It was unusual.
You have one of the most Irish names possible, Moria Linehan. I want to ask you, and I know Ireland is very important to you. It appears in many of your poems, and you visit often. Can you tell us why and how Ireland became such a solid anchor for you?
I have been lucky enough to travel to Ireland. I have had residencies at 2 different places in Ireland. One called the Kilrillig Project, which is in the southwest. It's out on cliffs. It's facing the North Atlantic. It's a very lonely and isolated spot, and it is magnificent in terms of the weather and what goes on there in terms of the light, the sky, and the various forms that rain can take. And the other place that I've been a couple of times is called the Tyrone Guthrie Center, which is, it's in the Republic, but it's north of Dublin. It's close to the border with Northern Ireland, and it's an old manor house. It's night and day in terms of the landscape, the setting. There's a chef there who cooks dinners for you, whereas when you're down at the Kilrillig Project, you're on your own to find food. So I eat a lot of peanut butter sandwiches when I'm there. But my latest book, Toward, has poems in it that talk about my Irish background, my family. I became interested in how my great-grandparents could have survived the famine. The famine years 1845 to 1852, and my relatives did not come until after 1852. And so, one thing led to another. I was in the National Archives looking up information about them, and there's always a thread that needs to be pulled a little tighter or a little looser. And so I continue to explore Irish-related subjects. One of the subjects in my new book is how come my father never, ever talked to me about the famine? And so I'm trying to understand the idea of a cultural silence around traumatic events. So I begin to explore that subject in this book.
Well, let me do one little housekeeping thing. I mentioned that your name is Moira Linehan. Your name on the square on your screen right now has your married name.
Right.
And so I want to make sure our audience didn't think I made a horrible mistake. I wanted to use your Irish name because
Well, that's what I used in writing.
Yes, yes. Now I noticed, speaking of Ireland, you begin and close your new book, Toward, with poems about Ireland. And I want to ask you about those specific poems. And if you would read one or another now and talk about its inception.
Okay. I don't know if this shows up on the screen,
Sure.
but
That looks good, sure.
okay. So I'm going to read the first poem in the book. It is set in the Kilrillig Project. The one that I had mentioned is in Southwest Ireland, out on cliffs.
Is that in Bantry Bay? Is that in Bantry?
No, it's about far southwest as you can get in the country before the country starts to turn north.
Okay.
Where there's a history of famine. They're always eating the grass. One or two look up startled when I walk near. They go on chewing. 4 o'clock one afternoon, I hear a herder whistle. His sheep come panting. What does he have that they want? Locals said it was coming. The hurricane off Bermuda turned this way. All week winds had moaned. Now screeching, they huddle round the cauldron of this cottage. Through the night they howl. The surf's poundings drowned out. Next day, the winds come off the cliffs. They swell the waves, march them toward the West Cork Hills. The waves spume white froth. Heavy, black-brimmed clouds follow after in endless parade. I climb toward Land's End. Winds won't let me walk straight. The sky's clearing. I chance it. I've not yet walked down to the Abbey's ruins. crows raise a ruckus, flush a feather-thin pheasant with its hurrying trail of tail. Only the well-fed could find meat on those bones. A famine's reach, like this land, where the heavens lower their weight on dark clouds. The bay and rain blur. The horizon, a vast front for thousands of miles of sea, where those left built cairns at the backs of their mouths.
It's a beautiful conclusion. I like the closure on that poem especially more.
Thank you.
Very nicely done.
Thank you.
You mentioned earlier that your father never talked about the famine. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you think that was?
I've done some reading about that famine. Well, and again, in the 1800s, there was something like 8 famines in Ireland, but I'm talking about the major one, the 1845 one to 1852. And the one thing that I have found is that they talk about the Irish needing to break with traditions, with customs, in that it became dangerous for people to hold wakes. And, you know, if you know anything about a good Irish wake, there's nothing sort of more central or critical to getting everybody together and having a good time at a wake. And so all that, again, for the longest time, Irish people would not drop that custom, and that just caused a further spread of the associated illnesses that came with famine, and the spread of disease. And so there's something that I have read about where when you break customs, when you break traditions, when people can't be buried properly, that there's something that then becomes, you're full of shame, and you don't want to talk about that at all. You don't want to admit it to yourself or to those who know you.
They have similar experiences to what we're experiencing here, that funerals and other gatherings, even if they're for the most important moral or social purposes, are
Right.
dangerous, very dangerous.
Right. And what that does when you can't attend a funeral, you can't honor someone. And, you know, I'm wondering, well, people say, well, after this is all over, and I'm wondering if people are going to want to go back to that grief, you know, a year hence, 2 years hence, what's going to happen to that experience?
Yes, yes. Your experiences in Ireland seem quite rich. They are a mine of poetic inspiration. And I've been in the country in Ireland as well. How often have you been, and when will you be, if travel loosens up, when will you go back again?
Well, I was supposed to be there in April. I had a 2-week residency at the Tyrone Guthrie Center, and they're saving a room for me when people from this country are allowed back. I'm not sure how soon I'll get on a plane, but you know, I have credit with Aer Lingus for an airplane, round-trip airplane, so ride. So we'll see.
We're not welcome in many cities or countries.
Right. But you know, there's something that happens too in the landscape there, and you know, the combination of the rain, the wind, the light, and what it draws out of me when I'm sort of isolated, when I'm alone, when I'm not, particularly at the Kilwillig Project, you have your own cottage and you're not sharing meals as opposed to the Tyrone Guthrie Center. What happens when you spend time by yourself like that? And falling back on a love that I have of landscape, traditions, there's so much religion that's present there, even though it's not visible. And like so much of the rest of the world, it's not practiced, but there are abbey ruins, church ruins. There's just the sense that this was sacred ground for people.
I get a sense that you think of landscape as a form of religion or an expression, direct expression of religion.
Yeah, because there's such a cultural roots within Ireland of the natural world, the spirit, the mystical, and the tradition of the monks.
May I ask you next about the title poem of your book, Toward, the poem Toward, which appears about in the middle of the text. And I'd like you to read that, maybe tell us something about its inception, and then we can talk about it a little bit.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. Toward is a poem that's set at the Tyrone Guthrie Center, and it's a very different landscape from where I was writing about, where there's a history of famine. And I'm glad that I read you that first poem, because I haven't counted them yet, but the number of periods and end stop lines in that poem give you a sense of, you don't move along rapidly when you're walking along cliffs. In contrast, there's this poem, Toward, where I was walking around this manor house that had woods, a significant forest, woods around them, and then the lanes, or you could call them roads. So let me read you Toward. I walk a mile down the road to Nublis, walk a mile away, walk the wooded path along the lake and out onto the lane, winding between muddy green hills. I'm nowhere but among mournful cows, their eyes bottomless wells that know a soul's dark nights. All their lives, cows stay put. One foot to the next, I keep moving, an end point always in mind. Village, next hillock, rounding the lake's loop. On I walk without being able to say why I must. The language here has been lost. Words like woods, cut down, hauled off or abandoned. Yet something remains of those who spoke it. What has always been beyond words, even when they had their own. That's where I'm headed.
Very nice. You're good at these closures. That's a very nice conclusion as well. So you're walking off into a mystical Gaelic landscape that I envision you disappearing into, at least for a couple hours.
But I'm back. But again, as you know, the British forbade the Irish people to speak their own language, to speak the Irish language. And so again, you can also see that much of the forest in Ireland have been destroyed, that there are singular trees. There are some stands of trees, but I link the disappearance of large forests with the disappearance of a language. I'm also aware, again, I am a walker. I enjoy walking. I like the peace of it. And there's also the tradition that you link walking with pilgrimage, and people going on pilgrimages to shrines for penance purposes. And so for me, there are a number of poems in this collection where I'm walking, and I wanted to link the walking poems with the sense of a search for something more than just the superficial. So that's part of why I chose it as a title poem.
One physical thing about Ireland occurred to me, that it's easier to be alone and isolated and by yourself in Ireland than it is, at least in the eastern United States.
Yes.
You can be isolated in the West, but it's tougher here. And Ireland is extremely rural.
Yes.
Dominated by farming and herding.
Still, yep.
Is that one of the magical qualities of that country for you?
Yeah, I mean, I also enjoy time in a pub too, like anyone else. But yeah, I do like this, and I feel safe walking there alone.
Yes.
Whereas there are a lot of places around here where I live in Reading now for the past couple of years that I won't walk alone. I don't know them yet, and I don't feel safe going into some of the wooded areas by myself.
Yeah.
Whereas for whatever reason, good or bad, I do feel much safer in Ireland.
Yes, yes, I feel safe in Ireland. Not so safe in a pub sometimes, but for different reasons. Too many pints. I'm watching the clock here. We're getting close to time. So I'd like to ask you more in conclusion,
Yes.
if you would read the last poem, Beneath an
Right.
Irish Sky.
Okay, this is still in the land in County Monaghan around the Tyrone Guthrie Center. And this is one of the times when I've just arrived. Beneath an Irish sky. Having just arrived, I can't say if it were days of showers or just one storm, maybe no longer than a fierce hour, left the ditches this slurry of mud, slick and red-brown. A thick brush has spread watery clouds, a gradient of black to rain gray, blurring in their hurry. These clouds, shrouds unwinding over hillocks or rising sky-filled washes. Are they coming? Going? I worry I'll be caught without an umbrella, so I turn back to the house, though in my turning, turn already from my purpose, having just arrived here for 2 weeks to be beneath a sky so vast I can do nothing but be emptied. Or is it filled? All my purposeful striding stopped in its tracks. When I look back at where I was, there's a cloud of a profile, its mouth, a crescent moon's open gape. Bright light radiates from behind its other cheek. No sun visible, but no doubt there. Sunday's gospel about the prodigal son, or depending how you read it, prodigal father. No need to walk any farther. Just look up, north, west, south, east. There's your inheritance.
Very, very well done. Very well done. I love these Irish poems and the others as well. I just got a Zoom notice. We're running out of time. I want to thank you, Moira, very much for being on the Writer's Block.
Thank you for having me.
It's been wonderful to see you again. And I hope that now that we've talked about Toward, that thousands flock to the store to pick up copies.
Yeah, or they can contact the publisher of Slant Books. If you go on their website has copies for sale.
Okay. If you have a digital copy of the cover or a digital copy of your website, please email those to me.
Okay, will do. And thank you again, John. All the best. All the best with your 31.
I'd also like to thank all the TV viewers in our audience for being with us tonight. If you've learned something about poetry from Moira Linehan and the importance of place from Moira Linehan, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.